On August 1st, 2021, lines of people moved along the dirt roads and forest trails surrounding the village of Maloyanaseyskoye. Police officers, investigators, rescue workers, volunteers, and among them walked a man who knew with absolute certainty that they were all searching in vain. He went from house to house, watched as they checked other people's properties, asked questions, maybe even helped. Meanwhile, the person for whom more than 200 people had gathered here was on his property, in the bathhouse, in the darkness, and she couldn't get out. But they never made it to his house that day. Now let's figure out how all of this began. The day before, on July 31st, a student who had come here for the summer with her family left Maloyanaseyskoye and headed toward the settlement of Semenevod for a bike ride. A quiet village, just over 2,000 residents, half an hour from Baisk, a place where nothing ever happens. Her parents expected her back by evening, but she never returned, and that same evening they contacted the police. By the morning of August 1st, the search had already reached a serious scale. Over 100 law enforcement officers, roughly the same number of volunteers, divers searched the bottom of the Bia River and further downstream, but found nothing. On the riverbank, they discovered shorts and a t-shirt, and the clothes were folded as if someone had simply gone for a swim. The first theory they began working was the obvious one, that she had drowned. But at the same time, they found the bicycle, and it was in a completely different location, 1.5 kilometers away in the forest. Nearby were glasses and a phone, and here's where a detail emerged that caught the investigators' attention immediately. On the bicycle frame, there were traces of red paint, not from a fence, not from a tree. This was contact with some kind of machinery, and based on the nature of the marks, a theory emerged that there had been a collision with something like a walk-behind tractor. After this, police along with volunteers began going door to door, checking yards, looking into garages, searching for red-colored equipment. And among those going through these yards with everyone else was one local resident. 40 years old, thin, wore glasses, quiet. Neighbors knew him as someone who didn't really socialize with anyone. He worked at a scrap metal collection point, lived reclusively behind a tall fence. He went from property to property just like everyone else. To understand how all of this became possible, we need to go back 24 hours, to the moment when she got on her bicycle and rode down the dirt road toward Semenevod. On July 31st, she left home after lunch. The route was familiar, a dirt road through the field, then along the forest, and on to Semenevod. She had ridden this way before, and there was nothing unusual about this trip. The road was unpaved, quiet. Cars were rare here, and in summer, few people even walked it. Heat, the chirping of grasshoppers, dust from under the wheels. One of those days that's impossible to remember later because it was no different from dozens of days just like it before. By evening, she wasn't back, and at first no one was particularly worried. Summer, vacation, probably got caught up playing Road Too Far. But as sunset approached, the anxiety began to grow. They called acquaintances. No one had seen her. Asked the neighbors. Nothing there either. They checked the road to Semenevod. It was empty. No bicycle, no traces, nothing at all. By nightfall, it became absolutely clear that this wasn't a story about being delayed or getting lost. She had left during the day on a familiar road and simply vanished. No call, no message, not a single trace. The phone wasn't answering. In villages like Maloyanaseyskoye, any disappearance is an extraordinary event. Here, everything is visible. Everyone knows who went where and what's in everyone's yard, who arrived yesterday and who left today. And when someone doesn't come home, it's noticed very quickly. But no one could understand what exactly had happened, because there was nothing suspicious that day. No scream, no noise, no unfamiliar cars. Everything went exactly as always. Only one thing changed. The dirt road she had taken turned out to be empty. The drowning theory looked convincing, and that, as would later become clear, was exactly how it was meant to look. The Bia in this area has a current. The bottom is uneven, and for someone who hadn't even finished 7th grade yet, it really would be dangerous. The logic was simple, terrible, and at first glance, completely clear. Then the inconsistencies began. First, The distance. If she went swimming, why leave the bicycle so far from the water? Not on the roadside, not by a path, but deep among the trees. This didn't look at all like the behavior of someone who simply decided to take a swim. The second inconsistency turned out to be even more serious, and it was noticed by locals. One of the village residents later told journalists directly, that very spot where the bicycle was later found, volunteers had searched it the day before, and the bicycle wasn't there. Definitely wasn't there. Which means it appeared there later, at night. Someone had brought it there. From this moment, the picture began to change. Because if the bicycle was planted, then the clothes on the riverbank might not have ended up there by accident either. It meant this whole story, the neatly folded clothing and the hint at swimming, had been constructed deliberately by someone who wanted them to search specifically in the water, who wanted the divers to spend hours, who wanted the drowning theory to absorb all the resources. And it did. For almost 24 hours, the search was directed toward the river, but the bayou was empty. And if no one had been there from the very beginning, then the question changed entirely. It was no longer about where the current might have carried someone. It was, where is she now? And who did all this? The logic shifted within minutes. It's one thing to search for someone who drowned. It's another thing entirely to search for whoever has red equipment in their yard. In a village of 2,000 residents, the number of walk-behind tractors and trailers is limited. They can be counted. Local resident Yekaterina Ozugina later told NTV in an interview that they came to their place that evening too, checking what equipment was in the yard. The search went from the village center toward the edges, from the nearest houses to the farthest. In a small village, this takes 1 or 2 days, no more. And if they had reached the end, they would have found it. Because in one of the yards, among piles of scrap metal, broken bicycles, old refrigerators, and coils of wire, stood exactly what they were looking for: a red walk-behind tractor with a trailer. And the owner of that yard, at that very moment, was walking with one of the search groups. He was listening to the conversations, watching how they checked other people's equipment, understanding the pattern of their movement and how many yards remained before his. This man knew the local equipment better than any district officer. And now he was watching the search teams methodically approach his fence, but he already understood it was a matter of time. The paint on the bicycle led straight to him, and every yard they checked shortened the distance. In a small village where everyone knows each other, the question of who has red equipment gets answered quickly. You don't need a database or a registry, you just need to ask the right person. And most likely, one of the locals pointed the way. There's this one guy here, collects scrap metal, knows every yard and every shed. He can tell you exactly who has what. When investigators arrived at the address, they saw a tall metal fence and a yard overgrown with weeds. Through the fence, they could make out structures, either garages or sheds. The homeowner wasn't there. His mother came out, said he had left, couldn't really explain where, kept contradicting herself, said one thing, then another. And for investigators accustomed to reading behavior, the signal was instant. Something was wrong here. Not left, in the ordinary sense, something else entirely. They began the search, and then the mother behaved even more strangely. She kept approaching the investigators and repeating the same thing: "You're looking in the wrong place." She didn't explain where exactly quote 3 was, gave no specifics, just stood nearby and insisted they were wrong. Forensic investigator Roman Shepoval later recounted that she refused to believe until the very end that her son could have been involved. The owner had vanished, but on the property they discovered a cellar, not an ordinary vegetable storage, but a deep pit several meters down, dug by hand in the steam room of the bathhouse, equipped, prepared. And as investigators examined what they found inside, it became clear that this wasn't about an accidental collision on the road, not about hitting someone and panicking. This had been planned and prepared long before July 31st. Oleg Viktorovich Lavkin, born in 1981, was born right here in Malo-Yanaseyskoye. He grew up here, never left for long, lived on Zelenaya Street. Any saleswoman at the village store would have given you the address without asking twice. A fellow villager named Alexander later told Rayon News that Lavkin had been married, raised a daughter, and no one had ever noticed anything strange about his behavior toward adolescents. For most people, he was just a local eccentric. According to neighbors, he only communicated with his mother and daughter, almost never with anyone else. The only exception was work-related contacts. He would bring cash to the store, ask to break large bills, and if he heard no, he would start a scene. The saleswomen remembered that well. He came to law enforcement's attention a few years before this whole story. One conviction: possession of prohibited substances in especially large quantities. According to one of the neighbors, in his younger days he had dealt with certain plants, collected them, and got caught. It didn't go to actual prison time. He got a suspended sentence. There were no other incidents on his record, and formally there was nothing that could have raised anyone's suspicions. Lavkin had one habit that everyone in the village considered completely harmless. He regularly went into the taiga, collected pine cones, medicinal herbs, could disappear for several days, sometimes a week. For village life, there was nothing unusual about this. A guy goes into the forest, comes back, goes again. The neighbors had long grown used to it. He knew the forest better than his own street. So, before disappearing from the village in early August, Lavkin told his family exactly what he always told them. He was going to gather pine cones. No one was surprised, and no one was suspicious. But there was one other person in his life who knew far more than the neighbors, more than his mother. For the last couple of years, his adult daughter had been living with him. The house was divided between two owners. On one side lived a neighbor, Lyudmila. On the other, Lavkin. Lyudmila later let reporters onto her property and showed them the 2-meter metal fence he had put up between them. Quote 5, she said briefly. It was impossible to see over that fence. What happened behind it was invisible and inaudible. From the street, the house looked as if it had been abandoned long ago. Moss had grown over the slate roof. Weeds had risen to window level. It had once been an ordinary village house with carved window frames, but now it seemed to have sunk into the ground, being pulled downward. A reporter from Komsomolskaya Pravda, who arrived in the village a few days after the events, wrote directly. Quote 6. No one wondered why he had so much junk in his yard. And certainly no one suspected that all this chaos on the property wasn't laziness or neglect. It was cover. Among those piles behind the fence, away from prying eyes, you could do whatever you wanted. Dig, build, equip, and not a living soul would notice. But the strangest contrast waited inside. No real renovation, bare walls, minimal furniture, but the technology was on a completely different level. A large, flat-screen TV, a good monitor, several modems for high-speed internet. For a recluse from a village of 2,000 people who makes a living collecting scrap metal, this was a setup that didn't fit anything at all. The investigators noted it immediately. A person whose yard is filled with rusty metal wasn't investing in comfort. He was investing in technology and connectivity. What exactly for would become clear later. For now, something else was more important. What was not inside the house, but beneath it. The neighbor through the wall heard everything, not words, sounds, dull thuds, scraping, something heavy being dragged across the ground, and this went on for a week. She later told journalists from Bisk TV, behind the wall, you could hear him digging something, and not just for 1 year. In the village, people are constantly building and tearing things down, and there's nothing suspicious about it. Police later established that Lavkin had been digging and equipping this cellar for 2 years. Investigator Konstantin Belousov, who led the case, mentioned a different time frame, 1 month. Most likely, they were referring to different stages. 2 years of general preparation, 1 month of final work, when the pit was transformed into a place suitable for holding a person. He most likely carried the dirt out through the yard, which was already piled with garbage anyway. No one would have noticed an extra mound of earth among all that mess. The cellar itself wasn't equipped for living, no light, no amenities of any kind, but it was enough to hold someone. The depth made it impossible to climb out without help. The walls were bare earth. The only exit was upward, through the steam room. Just close the hatch. From the outside, nothing visible, nothing audible. All that remained was to choose who to lower into it, and as the investigation would later establish, he began choosing back at the start of summer. The investigative committee later established, from June through July 2021, Lavkin had been watching her. Systematically, she had come to the village for the summer, and he noticed. He noticed her route, when she would go out on her bicycle, which road she took, what time of day. This fact was included in the indictment materials. In a small village, watching someone isn't difficult. It's enough to live on the same street, shop at the same store, step outside at the right time. Lavkin wasn't hiding in the bushes with binoculars. He was just watching, day after day, week after week, a quiet man in the yard, never in a hurry, never noticed by anyone. And that, essentially, is the perfect position for observation, when no one is watching you. During interrogation after his arrest, Lavkin would say something completely different. He would claim the attack was spontaneous, that he saw her on the road and acted on impulse, without preparation, without a plan. The investigation recorded this version, but it contradicted absolutely everything else. A cellar that had been dug for months, a stage scene with clothes on the riverbank, a bag and ropes that he had with him at the moment of the attack. None of this fit the narrative of an impulsive act. Direct evidence of daily surveillance was never found by the investigation, which is understandable. There are no cameras in the village, no recordings, no digital trail whatsoever, but the totality of facts spoke clearly. He knew who he was choosing. He knew when she would be alone. He knew where the road curved away from the residential areas. On July 31st, the right moment arrived. He was riding down that same dirt road on his red walk-behind tractor with a trailer. She was coming toward him on her bicycle. The road was empty, no cars, no people. The very moment he had apparently been waiting for since the beginning of summer. Drawing even with her, Lavkin shoved her hard. She fell from the bicycle. What happened next was reconstructed from case materials and from the victim's own testimony. He immobilized her, binding her hands and feet, put a bag over her head, lifted her and loaded her into the trailer of the walk-behind tractor. The tractor headed back toward his house, down the same dirt road, past the same fields. No one was encountered, and no one saw anything. At home, he drove the tractor behind the fence, lifted her from the trailer, carried her to the bathhouse, opened the hatch in the steam room, and lowered her down. Then chained her by the neck. She found herself in darkness, underground, in a space from which escape was impossible without help, in the cellar of the bathhouse belonging to a person she most likely didn't even know. Investigator Shepoval later recounted that Lavkin ordered the captive to remove her clothing, and it wasn't just about humiliation, though that was part of it too. He needed the clothes as props. He transported everything to the Bia River. He laid out the shorts and t-shirt on the bank neatly, as though she had undressed before going for a swim herself. He left the bicycle separately, 1.5 kilometers away in the forest, the phone and glasses next to the bicycle. But there was one detail he didn't account for, or simply didn't notice. Red paint from the walk-behind tractor remained on the bicycle frame. He transported it at night in the dark, probably loaded it into the same trailer, and didn't see that the trace was already there. On the morning of August 1st, hundreds of people went out to search. Everything was going exactly according to his script, and to confirm it personally, he went out with them. Without fuss, without unnecessary words, just another local who wanted to help. In camouflage, glasses, quiet. No one paid attention. He listened to the communications, knew which sectors had already been checked and which remained, knew where the divers were now and that the river theory was still holding. But at one point, the situation nearly turned against him. During interrogation after his arrest, Lavkin told investigators one detail that shows just how close he came to being caught. During the search, law enforcement was combing the territory around the village, and he ended up directly in their path. He hid in a hemp field, lay there while the group passed by. They didn't notice and moved on. The very fact that he was hiding speaks volumes. He wasn't just walking among the searchers, he was maneuvering, assessing where it was safe and where it wasn't, where he could appear and from where he'd better disappear. On the outside, a concerned neighbor. In reality, a man controlling and calculating his every step. But control was slipping. With every hour, the search expanded. Groups moved farther and farther from the river. The drowning theory was cracking. She spent the first night in the pit beneath the steam room. Darkness, earthen walls, a chain on her neck. Above, silence. Not a sound, not a voice, not a hint that anyone was searching. Lavkin came down to her and explained the rule. If she tried to escape, he would end her. The investigation would later classify this separately as a threat whose reality there was every reason to believe. After the first night, he moved her from the steam room into the crawl space of the main house to a far corner. According to investigator Belousov, Lavkin decided that she would be harder to find there if someone did come with a search warrant. The bathhouse would be the first thing they might check. The house was deeper, farther, less noticeable, and then his behavior changed. To the threats, something else was added. Lavkin began talking, a lot. He told her about his life, about having lived in Moscow, about books he'd read. Investigator Belousov later noted that he was quite a well-read person, which didn't match at all with the image of a village recluse. But that was exactly how he presented himself, as a person who had been underestimated, misunderstood, who had something to say. She wasn't even 13 yet. She sat in the darkness underground, and he talked to her as if this were a normal situation, as if it were possible to first terrorize someone, then immediately try to win them over. First break, then tame. And this wasn't impulse, this was strategy. The same strategy used for years by the Skopinski kidnapper, Mokov, to whom Lavkin would later be compared. 2 days of darkness, threats, and monologues. He calculated that this would be enough, that she would break and accept her role. But he was wrong. Investigator Konstantin Belousov, who led the case, later shared a detail that changes the entire picture of what was happening in that cellar. He described her behavior in a single phrase. Quote 7. She did everything he said. She listened to his monologues. She didn't argue, didn't provoke, gave him no cause for anger, nor for a sense of total control. This was something else entirely. Most likely, this is exactly what threw him off. Lavkin had prepared for other reactions: fear, panic, pleading, something that would give him a feeling of control. Instead, he got composure that he could neither explain nor subjugate. There was nothing for him to break, because nothing on the outside was breaking. His entire strategy, designed for a person in a state of shock, encountered someone who proved more resilient than he had anticipated. He was 40 years old, and in this pair, it wasn't the one below who was disoriented. She simply held on, hour by hour, night by night, without a single sign that help was coming. And outside, while she held on, the noose around Lavkin was tightening. During this time, there was one other person in the house, his adult daughter, who had been living with him for the past couple of years. She was there on July 31st. She was there when he lowered the captive into the bathhouse cellar. She was there when he went out to join the search groups in the morning. And she was there both nights. She knew from the very beginning. Investigator Belousov spoke about this directly. The young woman knew about the captive but did not report it to police. The reason? Fear. She was afraid that her father would do something to her or to the one below, that any word from her might provoke him. And this isn't indifference. This is the paralyzing terror of someone who lives next to a person they know better than anyone. She saw how he watched, saw how he prepared, and understood that this person was capable of anything, not because she read about it somewhere, but because she lived with it every day. The daughter only spoke after Lavkin released the captive and fled. Then she told investigators everything and added a detail that confirmed what the neighbors already knew. He most likely went into the forest. But while he was nearby, she stayed silent. The case went beyond the district level. Chairman of the Investigative Committee of Russia, Alexander Bastrikin, placed the investigation under the control of the Central Office and instructed the head of the regional directorate to personally lead the search. And this meant one thing. Resources were no longer limited. Now responsibility for results lay not only with the local authorities. The search had entered a phase that Lavkin could no longer control. And when door-to-door canvassing begins in a small community, sooner or later they reach everyone, every fence, every gate, every shed. They simply hadn't made it to Lavkin's house yet. The captive was returned before volunteers reached his sector, but Lavkin didn't know that yet. And the question was no longer whether they would find him. The question was when. The night of August 2nd, the second day. And at this moment, Lavkin makes a decision. That night he opened the cellar, removed the chain, and let her go. Investigator Konstantin Belousov later explained it simply. He got scared. Lavkin realized that the yard-by-yard search was continuing. Sectors were closing one after another, and everything he had built over 2 years had collapsed in 2 days. Belousov added a detail that explains much. He said that usually in such crimes victims rarely remain alive, that more often things end differently. But Lavkin, in the investigator's opinion, simply didn't have the nerve for that outcome. He wasn't ready for the final step. He was ready to dig a cellar, to watch, to abduct, to keep someone on a chain, but not for what people do when they understand there's no way out anymore. And he chose flight. She climbed out and ran. She reached home. She told her parents everything: who, where, how. She showed them the house where she had been held. The night of August 1st to 2nd, 2 days were over. The news spread through the search groups instantly. Found, alive. Not at the bottom of the river, not in the forest, alive. Psychologists began working with her immediately. She wasn't in a hurry to go outside, but she recorded a video message, short in an even voice. She wanted to say a huge thank you to all the volunteers, to people she knew and didn't know who had come and participated in the search. 2 days in a cellar, and the first thing she did after being freed was thank those who had searched for her. Lavkin by this point was already in the forest. He left that night, the same night he released the captive. By morning, he was neither in the house nor in the village. The bulletin was put together quickly. Height 170 to 175 centimeters, thin build, dark blonde hair, glasses, dressed in camouflage, a jacket with a hood and anti-mosquito netting, on his feet, blue footwear, on his back, a khaki-colored backpack. The Ministry of Internal Affairs promised a reward for any information about his whereabouts. Bulletins were posted across the entire Altai Krai and then throughout the Altai Republic, literally on every pole. His face was known to everyone who read the news or even walked past a bulletin board. But Lavkin wasn't traveling by road. He was going through the forests, several nights in a row, on foot, through the taiga, alone. He slept by day, moved by night, stayed far from populated areas, rafted down rivers on makeshift rafts. After making it on his own to the village of Maima, he changed tactics, got on a regular scheduled bus and rode to Ongudai, the district center of the Altai Republic, 260 kilometers from Bisk. A different region, different territory. Most likely he expected that no one would know him here, but in Ongudai he saw his own wanted posters. They were already here. Lavkin understood he couldn't enter the village. He settled somewhere nearby, away from people. A week and a half without proper food, without shelter, without contact with anyone. A week and a half while the entire country searched for him, and he sat in the forest, 260 kilometers from home, waiting for who knows what. But hunger is something the taiga doesn't forgive forever. August 12th, the village of Kurota, Ongudai District, Altai Republic. Day 12 of the escape. A local resident, 36 years old, was fishing on the riverbank when he spotted an unfamiliar man. Thin, in dirty clothes, clearly exhausted, standing by the water, washing himself. The face seemed familiar. The fisherman remembered the bulletin he'd seen in recent days, checked his memory, and called the police. The district officer and an investigator left immediately. They found him not by the river anymore, but on one of Kurota's streets. Lavkin was calm but suspicious. He gave a false name, said he had come to the Altai Mountains for work, to gather nuts, no documents, lost them. It all sounded smooth, except for one thing. In his belongings was a passport in the name of Oleg Lavkin. That's where the cover story ended. Upon arrest, he confessed. Yes, it was him. Yes, he held a captive in his cellar for 2 days. Then he released her and left. While Lavkin spent 12 days making his way through the forests, it wasn't just police and investigators searching for him. A volunteer from Biysk named Roman Novikov sold his motorcycle to buy a quadcopter with thermal imaging for 300,000 rubles, specifically for this search. A stranger gave up his own transportation to find the kidnapper, and the one they were looking for was caught because he decided to wash himself in a river. On August 13th, Lavkin was transported under guard to Altai Krai. The interrogations began, and what the investigation learned during those interrogations changed the scale of the case entirely. During interrogation, Lavkin admitted guilt on all counts, but the word _8_ here turned out to be far broader than anyone had imagined. The investigation established that the kidnapping on July 31st was not his first offense against a minor. In the course of the investigation, an episode from 2015 surfaced. Lavkin's mother had taken in a 13-year-old orphan under guardianship. The girl lived in the house. Lavkin had access to her, and he took advantage of it. According to sources during the investigation, he had recorded videos with this ward, who by that point was 16, and had been selling them. During the search of the house, video recordings of an intimate nature were discovered featuring young women who, according to investigator Belousov's description, _9_2 additional counts of offenses against minors. Not a single victim was random. This was a system. And now everything that had seemed like the eccentricity of a quiet recluse fell into a completely different pattern. The tall fence wasn't a quirk. It was concealment. The seclusion wasn't personality, it was calculation. For years, he had built a space where he could do what he wanted and remain invisible. On September 29, 2022, the Biysk District Court delivered its verdict. The hearings were held behind closed doors as the case involved a minor. The prosecution requested 18 years. The court gave 20, a maximum security penal colony, plus 2 years of restricted freedom after serving the sentence. Lavkin admitted guilt, but considers the sentence too harsh. In his words, he quote 10-20 years for kidnapping, for threats, for everything he had done toward this, and for everything he had managed to hide for years. He wasn't stopped by cameras or facial recognition systems or databases. He was stopped by people, 200 people who refused to believe she had drowned, and went door to door. A fisherman who remembered a face from a wanted poster. A volunteer who sold his motorcycle for a quadcopter. A village that rose to its feet. Lavkin had counted on one thing, indifference, that no one would search for too long, that the river theory would work, that in a small village, nobody cares. He was unlucky. Turns out, people do care. What do you think about this video? Write in the comments, subscribe to our channel, hit like. See you next time.